name's Angie McKinney, and I'm a consultant with the Indiana IEP Resource Center. And I've got a short window of time for us to talk about MTSS, or multi-tiered system of support. So some of you have probably heard MTSS. Some of you may be starting to implement something like this in your buildings. But my guess is that you've got some people in here who say MT what are you talking about? Because it's not common terminology yet in Indiana. It will be. I can guarantee you it will be. But it's not necessarily something all that new and different. It's a shift in thinking about the framework. So it's not a new program. It's the way we organize what we do and how we blend everything together to meet the needs of all of our students. So I know a lot of things that we've been discussing yesterday and today have to do with children with disabilities. MTSS is focused on every living, breathing body within your building. So I just want to start by asking, what do you have going on in your schools? We're going to talk about where we are now, what exactly MTSS is, and how that's different from some of the things that we have been doing in the past, some of those key components of MTSS, and then just a little bit about how to get started. This is not a how to do it kind of training. You'd need days to work on this, and all the right bodies in the room to even think about what are we going to do next. Okay, but just a little bit about getting started. So think about what you already have in place in your buildings. Most of you have a lot of these different programs already in place. Who has RTI? Or some version of RTI, right? We've been doing this for a long time. And I hear a lot of people say, well, MTSS, that's just another name for RTI. And they're maybe a teeny bit right in saying that, but for the most part, MTSS is larger. It's subsuming RTI underneath that MTSS umbrella or framework. Title I, you may have Title I in some of your buildings. You may have it, system-wide, just depending on what the situation is in your building. Gifted and talented programs. Some schools have PBIS, or at least have some sort of positive behavior programs going and in place. We've all got students with disabilities, students on 504 plans, a lot of different programs happening. How many of you have students who English is not their native language? How many of you have good programs that are addressing that? Fewer hands. I mean, we've got a lot of things. We've got a lot of diversity in our building, and not just based on skin color. We've got diversity coming from all angles, and kids need different things, and staff need different things. Staff need different levels of support. So some of the issues, these programs are great. We love them, right? Otherwise we wouldn't keep doing them year after year. But there are some issues with some of the ways that we currently implement those programs. Part of that is we create silos. This is your program, your money, your stuff. This is my program. It's all separate. We may have a meeting that's just Title I. Title I, the kids in Title I are also in various other programs and classrooms. So we want to make sure that we're not operating within those silos. Sometimes there is a redundancy in what we do. We're all doing the same thing over and over again. So some kids are getting some intervention over here, and then they're getting basically the same thing during Title I time, and then maybe they're getting that same thing in the classroom. If that's what they need, that's fine, but a lot of times we're being redundant because we're not communicating about what we're doing with the other programs. So that lack of communication can be an issue as well. Sometimes it can lead to more restrictive programs for students. If we have kind of that all or nothing thinking about a student, like this is a tier 2 kiddo, Not really. It's a student that may be receiving some Tier 2 support for something in particular, but they're not a Tier 2 kid. Or I've heard the term in lots of schools, well, that's a resource kid. Well, no, they may go to the resource room and receive support for a particular issue, but that's not all of what they're about. So it's that thinking of what program are you in? Are you an EL kid? Are you a special ed kid? Well, I could be a lot of things, but only to different degrees, depending on what my needs are. And sometimes there is a lack of connection between what's going on in the gen ed classroom and what's going on in the curriculum at that grade level and the content that's being taught and the other things that we do. And I hear that out in the buildings when I ask, okay, what interventions are you maybe doing for this kid? And they can tell me. Now, how is that supporting what's going on in the classroom? Well, I'm not sure what's going on in the classroom because the programs are all operating pretty independently of what's going on in the real world of the regular ed classroom. So these are just some graphics that you've probably seen year after year after year with RTI or PBIS. And you see that the way this is set up, we've got the dreaded triangle that we've all grown to hate so much. And we have all these percentages about who should be at what tier of the triangle. And we've spent countless hours going to sessions related to RTI, related to positive behavior intervention support over the years, and almost every national expert that I've heard, when they get asked about these percentages and where they came from, they will tell you, somebody just came up with them. They're not based on anything. They sounded good at the time when the triangles were created, and we thought, yeah, well, 80% sounds pretty good here, and 15 here, yeah, that sounds about right. There's nothing magical about any of those numbers other than to say that the majority of kids should get their needs met through what we do for everyone at a base level. And fewer kids should need that more intensive support. So that's really all that means. All right, so you can see there's a big divide down the middle though. And that divide really represents to me the fact that these programs, although the intent was for them to be together, a lot of schools will have just one or the other. Yeah, we have RTI for academics, but we don't have PBIS. Or yes, we're really focused on PBIS, but we don't have a strong academic intervention program. Or some schools will even say, you know what, we've decided that we really could only focus on one area, so we just do RTI for reading. You got a math problem? I'm sorry about your luck. We'll see you when it's time for testing eventually, but we only have intervention programs for reading. Or they only have certain programs, and if your need does not match up with the program, then there isn't as much support for what we can do to meet those kids' needs. So some of you have probably seen this graphic before. Hopefully yesterday and today you've seen this graphic before as well. This graphic kind of started out in the special ed world in Indiana, and it has branched out because really it's about meeting the needs for all students, and it was included in the draft of ESSA that was sent to the governor's office. So this is an important graphic to know about. It is available on the IDOE website, and it is clickable. So you can go to each of the pieces and parts and click on that to get more resources, to watch short shares that have to do with that particular topic. So you can see that it's all about working together, setting those high standards for students, that collaborative work, making sure that it all ties back in to supporting all students and providing equitable education and access to the curriculum. So it's all tied in. I love the graphic. I think they call it the bagel. Is that right, Kristen? The bagel. So if you hear about the bagel, that's what they're talking about, not something yummy. Okay, so let's dig into what exactly MTSS is. So again, it's multi-tiered system of supports. One system, and there's lots and lots of support out there, but that system pulls all of those things together. So some of these graphics that are in here were taken from the SWIFT Center, which is a National Technical Assistance Center. I think it's school-wide, I can't remember the I, but it has to do with school transformation and taking schools to that next level to provide inclusive education for all students. And so the graphic that they used here in talking about MTSS is looking at not just thinking about the old RTI kind of system, but tying this into the administrative leadership that's needed in order to keep all this going. So we know we can have a great program if we don't have administrative backing to keep this moving forward, then it's probably not going further. Integrated educational framework, so tying all those pieces and parts together. And family and community engagement is an important piece of that as well, to make sure that we connect our families and connect those community resources in to provide all those different supports that students need. And inclusive policy structure and practice. If we don't all believe that inclusion is important, then none of this really matters. But if we have that mindset that all students deserve to be part of the greater school community and have access to the curriculum and access to their gen ed peers and all those things going on, then that's what we have to believe in order for any of this to make sense or to work. Now, I do want to remind you, though, what I'm not saying is that every kid needs to be in gen ed every second of every day, because you can probably all think of a kiddo in your building that needed some time to do something else in a different setting, right? We all have more than one. We know more than one. But the intent is to make sure that we're still connecting them to everything that's going on in the building and that we're providing services for students with disabilities in the least restrictive environment. So, all right, it's not a triangle. It's kind of a couple of trapezoids blended together. But it's close to a triangle, I know. In thinking it is. But this is the graphic that they use. And I like the way this is set up because, again, there's no hard percentages. There's no 80%. But it's saying that all students get universal supports. We set up our buildings, we set up our programs to meet the needs of as many students as possible. We build our buildings in a certain way to meet the needs of the masses, right? We hire the right number of staff if we can find them. We design the minutes for each of our periods in the day are designed to try and meet the needs of as many people as we can in the building. Okay, so universal supports. Some students need additional supports, and then that few number of students need the really intensified supports. And then you'll see kind of down the diagonal, you've got 3 different colors that represent kind of the braiding of all of the different systems together, or all of the different supports that would be under this umbrella. And that's UDL, that it's differentiated, and that everything is integrated. And I'm going to tell you what I mean by those different things. Okay, so first, when we look at the different levels of support, you'll see a lot of similarities, right? We have teams that are operating together. We're always operating under that continuous improvement process. We're assessing. We're using data. It's a little bit different in how it plays out at the different levels, but for the most part, we're looking at the same kinds of processes and the same kinds of thinking, just on a more intensified level and a more specific level for what the kids need, depending on what their needs are. Okay, so back to this and looking at those three different colors, okay, that represent the braiding. UDL is Universal Design for Learning. And some buildings make this a very explicit part of how they plan everything. They say, we're not going to wait for a different kid to come to us and make changes or make tweaks. What we do is think ahead to all the diversity that could come our way in our classroom and our building, and we plan ahead for this. So right now, you get a new kid in your classroom and somebody says, okay, this kid needs read aloud, extended time, and they don't do very well with oral expressions, so you're going to have to do something different there. And you think, oh my gosh, one more thing that I've got to do. If we're using the principles of UDL, and I'm trying to shrink days worth of UDL training down into about 1 minute, so don't think that I'm giving you everything here. But I'm planning ahead for what could be all the different needs of students. And I'm planning in different ways. So this is kind of, this is an overall graphic that CAST uses to represent Universal Design for Learning and the different ways of thinking that students have, different parts of the brain that are represented. And we're thinking about the why behind learning, the what of learning, and the how of learning. And it's accessing kind of different parts of what students do in the classroom or at school. So it has to do with different ways that we can engage students, because we know we don't hook them all the same way, right? I may be reading something that I think is very interesting, and some of my kids are right with me. And then I've got a few that they're just not engaged in what's going on. I've got to hook them differently than I do other students. Some of it has to do with the representation of learning itself. I may learn better hearing something, and somebody else may need a hands-on activity in order to really get it in. But what we're concerned about as people in education is getting it in, right? I don't care how I get it in, as long as I can get it in. I don't care how I can get you engaged, as long as I can get you engaged. And then in the end, the action and representation piece, I want to know, did you get it? If you can show me on the regular Scantron test that you got the info, great. But not everybody can do that. But if you can tell me or show me that you get it and you understand, that should be good, right? We just want to know that we're bringing them in, we're getting the info in, and we have a way to assess that they got it. Okay? So I'm going to, because we're short on time, I'm not really going to skip through this, or I am really going to skip through this, but you guys will have this on the slides. But again, UDL training is something that if you're interested in, there are trainings out there. There are also some online modules through IU that are really good related to UDL that you can get on and take for free. So lots of different resources out there that can support you. There are some school districts in Indiana that everything they do is based on UDL. And it makes a huge difference, not just for students with disabilities, but for all students. I had some opportunity to talk with Bartholomew County schools that everything they do is guided by the principles of UDL. And they were sharing that they had more and more students who were not the top students now taking AP classes and demonstrating knowledge in those AP classes. And some of them were students with disabilities. Now, a lot of our kids with learning disabilities and emotional disabilities are some of our highest thinking students. They just have a glitch in the way that they either access the information, share out the information, or get engaged in the process. So I'm going to skip past UDL, but just understanding that in a multi-tiered system of support, there has to be thinking about the global school environment and planning for the needs of all students, which makes sense. If that's what we're trying to do with providing what kids need, then UDL just makes a lot of sense. Okay, differentiated. So again, this goes hand in hand with universal design for learning, and that's that not all kids need the same thing. We can't expect students to learn the way we teach. We have to teach the way they learn, and we have to differentiate based on what we know about students. So this is just one definition for differentiated instruction, a way of thinking about teaching and learning designed to assist teachers in recognizing, understanding, and addressing student differences that are inevitable in virtually all classrooms. If you have a classroom full of kids that are all the same, you let me know, because that may be a sign of the apocalypse, because that doesn't happen, right? You never have all students that learn the same way. So we have to prepare for and respond to those differences. So some of the essential pieces associated with differentiating and differentiated instruction. Making sure that that learning environment is supportive. We have to make sure kids feel safe to ask questions, that they don't have to all get the happy stickers every day, right? But they have to feel like I can be supported in my learning, whether I'm down here or whether I'm up here or anywhere in between. We've got to have a quality curriculum. We know that. That's why we review curriculum regularly, to make sure that it's still meeting the needs of our kids. It could be a great curriculum and not match up with the population that you have and what they need. We also have to make sure that we are doing assessments to inform learning and instruction. So not just doing assessments for the sake of, yes, I checked that off the list, but this is an assessment that will actually tell me, where do we go from here? What do my kids need next? And if we don't have that, we've got to come up with it. We've got to design it. Making sure that our instruction responds to the differences in the classroom that we have, and then also making sure that our classroom is set up in a way for us to deliver that. If you are a person that likes your room in nice, perfect, beautiful rows, but yet the way that you feel like your students need to be taught is a lot of small group instruction, your classroom's not real conducive to that, right? Think about the way that the classroom structure itself is organized so that you can reach the students you need to, and that you can do the things that you really need to do in the classroom. So that's the differentiated piece. And the last piece is just integrating everything. So if I get data in my program, I need to share it. Having a folder full of all the Title I assessments that happened is fine, but if it sits in that folder and doesn't get shared with everyone else who's working with the student, then you're really limiting the utility of that data. So making sure that we share it, we share information across programs, that we are communicating, and I would even have a very specific plan for communication. How are we going to communicate? It's not like we can say we're going to have this many extra meetings, because we don't have enough time in the day to add more meetings. Maybe it's a shared Google Drive where we're putting information and we all get to access it. Or, you have to come up with whatever would meet the needs of the staff in your building. Sharing resources. I'm going to pick on you guys. That's okay. The sign on your bookshelf. What does that say? These are not Title I resources, right? We all have that kind of stuff in our building because we have purchased things through different funds, and people want the good stuff, right? If you've got a good resource, somebody else is always trying to get their hands on it. And we've been in that mindset for years that, well, this was purchased with this money, and so you guys can't touch that. And then there are these resources over here. Now, it's very different if you've shelled some money out of your own pocket and you bought some stuff for your classroom. You don't want people coming in raiding your stash of good stuff. But the resources in the building ought to be resources for the building. So I know that's not the intent of that, but that sign always just kind of cracks me up, because I'm thinking, okay, there was a problem at one point with programs not sharing what they had, which would include data a lot of times as well. And then finding lots of ways to cross curricula, cross environments, and cross personnel. So when we're providing Title I, does it need to be in a Title I room? Or can the Title I person push in and do some specific work in the classroom that's integrated into what's going on? And we've already done this in a lot of different ways. You know, we do if we're going to do something in writing, we may focus in on a subject that's going on in science or social studies. We're crossing as much as we can. We want to think about crossing in a lot of those different areas too. Blending in the social skills support that your class needs into a lesson. You know, weaving in lots of different supports that we have so that we're connecting everything together. You're going to get a lot more generalization for students when we do that, so that they're not just performing in one setting under certain conditions. It's going to generalize to different areas the more that we cross things. Okay, so again, those three colors just kind of represent that we're braiding all of this together. There's no distinct Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. I can't cross a line and say, oop, suddenly I'm a Tier 3 kid, right? It's all blended together, because each of my needs, I could be considered in a different area of this kind of graphic. And I'll show you what I mean by that here in just a minute. So some of the questions that come up are, okay, but what about all this stuff? Where does it happen? Because in some of the old models, we would have tiered support, and then you'd ask, well, okay, where's the special ed? And some people would say, well, that's Tier 3. That really is Tier 3. And I had other people tell me, well, that's not even on the triangle. It's this little area out here all by itself. It's not connected with the triangle. And if you think about where all these different kind of programs should happen within that model, it's everywhere. It's across the board. You're just going to see that it depends on the kid, it depends on the need, where we put all these things in place. Okay? So I like this graphic. This graphic comes from George Takei, and it represents that thinking of individuality in where you would kind of be pictured within this kind of a system. Now, he's still on the old triangle, so you got to bear with me with the triangles again for a minute. But if we're looking at where kids need different supports, none of our kids are a single dot. They're more like this. So if we look at Fiora and look at her different needs, if we think about her technology skills, how she performs in social studies, her basketball skills, she doesn't need any support when it comes to some of those different skills that are out there. She's needing a little bit more support in writing Spanish. She's getting up there where it's not quite as strong, but she's not needing any sort of intensive support. And then when you look at science and math, that's where she's needing support. So what do you can't say, well, this is a student in Tier 3, this is a student in Tier 2. Well, it depends on what you're asking about, where I would say that she needs the different supports. There's another example. So for Malcolm, he's got, again, lots of really good skills that he's not needing anything different than what we're already doing for the rest of his classmates. But then you get to the problem solving, and what is that? Anger anger management. Those are things that he needs a lot more intensive support. So if you think about a student that's in your classroom right now, for those of you who have a classroom, and you try to map them out as to what they need across different skills, every kid is going to have a different profile. And for some kids, these lines don't even make sense because they may have lots of lines across the bottom and no lines at the top, or just things that scatter throughout the bottom section. And we have some kids that are red zone all the way, right? We've got different degrees of what they need support in. Even those kids, if you think hard enough, you're going to be able to come up with some things that float near the bottom that they don't need support with.
Hi, my name is Shelley Moore, and I'm a third-year Ph.D. student at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. As Canadians, we have a reputation for finding and embracing the strength in our diversity. This value, however, hasn't been reflected in our classrooms, which still segregates students by ability, especially students with developmental disabilities. There's a gap in our understanding about what we know inclusive education to be, philosophically, versus what we understand and the importance of understanding inclusion in our practice. This is the question I'm trying to answer in my research, is how can we find the value in the day-to-day practice in our classrooms in terms of inclusive education? So how am I going to explain this to you? Now I can sit here and try and describe this, or we could have a little bit more fun. Why don't we go bowling? So let's talk about bowling. You have 10 pins, you have 2 balls, and you have a lane. The goal is to knock down as many pins as you can. But if you don't get them all, it's okay because you have another chance. But when I bowl and roll the ball down the middle and I don't knock them all down, what often ends up happening to me is that there's 2 pins left standing on either end and they stare at you. It's the 7-10 split and it's the hardest shot in bowling. How is bowling like teaching? The ball was the lesson, the pins are the kids. We aim for the middle, we do the best we can. The pins that are left standing, we often have another chance to kind of get to them, but at the end of the day, those 2 pins that are staring, looking at you, are kids who need the most support and are kids who need the most challenge. So we end up choosing one, and the other one is left standing. I just took all the fun out of bowling. Now, I don't know how many times you've watched professional bowling, but I spent an afternoon watching professional bowling, and let me tell you, there was not one bowler who rolled that ball down the middle of the lane. They throw the ball down the lane at a curve. And I was actually really curious about this, so I called up a professional bowler. He was so excited. I don't think he gets a lot of calls about education. He said the reason why the ball has to enter at a curve is because you will knock down more pins and create a bigger domino effect if you enter at that angle. But in order to do that, you have to change your aim. In order to knock down the most pins with one shot, he aims for the pins that are the hardest to hit. Now let's just let this sink in for a second. We are taught to teach the head pins. We are not taught to teach to the kids who are the furthest and the hardest to get to. The kids with autism, the kids with Down syndrome. The part that's critical here, and it really aligns with universal design for learning, is that so often the supports that we design for those kids on the outside of the lane are actually supports that all of the kids need. This is the part we need to understand if inclusive education is going to move forward in Canada. How can we find this value of diversity in our classrooms between the students? This is not just important for the outside pins, but it's critical for every single one of us. And just think, all we need to do is change our aim. Look how bowling changed education.
What I want to look at here, this is just another way to kind of conceptualize MTSS in thinking about all of our students are in this big green circle. Okay, all of our students need universal supports. And the model is also looking at making sure that in Tier 1, that we're doing everything for Tier 1 for everybody. And then we have some students that are going to also, so this is always in addition, need some more support, some additional supports. And then we have a few students who will need really intensive supports. Now, part of the reason why MTSS is purposeful in bringing together both behavioral, social, emotional supports and academics is because they often go hand in hand. A lot of times we may start with one or the other and lead to having both of these things going on, but for different reasons, depending on where the starting point was. So sometimes when we have those combined challenges, it's because we started out with some behavior issues, and the behavior is now interfering with what's going on in the classroom, and I'm getting excluded more, right? So I'm either having to leave the classroom, go to the principal's office, or maybe I'm kicked out for a few days, or whatever that is. Every minute that I'm out of the classroom, I'm losing a minute of instruction. The more instruction I miss, the more likely I'm going to also have some academic problems start to surface that may not be related to a learning disability of any kind. It may have to do with the fact that I'm just not getting the instruction right now because of my behavior problem. Sometimes the behaviors are focused more on that social and academic kind of issues that are coming up related to attention. I'm not focused on everything I need to, and because of that lack of focus, again, I may have some academic problems that are cropping up because of that. Sometimes when I start out with academic problems, it leads to some social rejection. And suddenly I'm not one of the smart kids, and I'm not getting invited to the parties, or somebody doesn't want to be in my group because they know it's going to be harder to have me in their group, and it leads to more behavioral and social emotional kinds of issues. And then sometimes the academic pieces and the social behavior can really just go hand in hand. I mean, sometimes we're coming in with both of those things, and they're all just so very interconnected. Now, we still have some kids who are high-flying academics that have some behavioral challenges. And we have some kids who behaviorally and socially are doing a stellar job, but they have some serious academic problems. But we're seeing a lot more of the overlap in classrooms. So we want to make sure that those programs are also working together and not just working on one piece or the other when it comes to students. So going back to this graphic then, we're going to go through this again. This is what we've got in our buildings, or this is what we should have in our buildings. Now, if we look at each of those tiers individually, tier 1, again, it's everybody. And we do some screening at that point. We've got to know who needs what, right? And until we do some kind of screening to know who might need additional support, we won't have that information. We want to make sure that the core programs we're using are evidence-based and they're also culturally responsive. So again, we have to know our kids to know what that means. We have to know what cultures we have in our building, you know, what backgrounds are out there, where are our kids coming from, what's their socioeconomic status. You know, we have to know all of this stuff to know how to best respond to what they need. We also need to make sure that universal design for learning is implemented throughout the building, and we're differentiating that we are keeping track of fidelity. Have you guys heard of fidelity measures? Okay, treatment integrity, that's another kind of phrase that's used. The idea is that there's a lot of good stuff out there, but if we're not implementing it as it's supposed to be implemented, then we're not going to get the same results. So if I'm implementing a particular reading program in the classroom, it could be something that in the research says, oh my gosh, you're going to make stellar gains, you're going to, you know, grow this many words per minute, you know, over the course of this many weeks. But if I'm not doing it the way the manual said, you need to implement this for 30 minutes every day or whatever that is, I'm not going to see those same results. So I can't make good judgments about what needs to happen program-wise unless we're also doing some periodic checks on, are we doing it right? Sometimes we really think we are and then we drift, right? We may even learn it correctly, start out doing it correctly, and then after you've done it for 2 years, think, well, I don't need the manual anymore. I've been doing this for 2 years. But if you go back 6 months later and check, you're not using the right language anymore, or maybe you're doing things out of order. And then regular progress monitoring, and we do that by assessing kids 3 times a year. And that's pretty standard in most buildings, whether it's NWEA testing or, for a long time we were using acuity out in the buildings. A lot of elementaries are using dibbles. Whatever the situation is, we want to keep track because kids change. They don't change day by day, but they change over the course of a few months. And if we can assess that at least 3 times a year, then we can monitor that we're still on the right track with this larger group of kids. So then to go back to Tier 1 and look at this, we've got all these different pieces and parts, but even within Tier 1, we do a lot of changing around and grouping, right? We do this for the large group of kids. We've got high, middle, low groups in a lot of our reading programs going on, and that's what we're doing for everybody. So there's still changing and grouping that's happening at that core level. And again, we want to make decisions based on data. So if we have good data to say we're doing it correctly and the students are performing okay, then that tells us Tier 1 is working. Those kinds of supports that we're providing are working. It's when we get data that says they're not doing so well, then we first look at that fidelity and say, okay, were we doing it right? Because if we weren't, we want to go back and do it right and give that a shot first. But if we're doing it correctly and they're not getting what they need from the program, then we need to add on some additional supports. So Tier 2 then is in addition to Tier 1. Okay, so this is the next level of supports. In this case, we're talking about smaller groups of kids at a time. We can do that in a variety of ways, whether it's in the classroom or in another setting, but we can break kids into smaller groups. We do this pretty naturally in a lot of our elementary classrooms. We have small group activities all the time. We're not quite as strong at that in middle and high school because it doesn't feel quite as natural, but it can be done just as easily. It's just a shift in thinking. So smaller groups to provide this supplemental instruction, and then we're progress monitoring a lot more often because I really want to know if I'm going to commit staff to providing this service, is it working? You don't just keep doing something and hope that by the end of the year we can figure it out. We want to be progress monitoring a couple of times a month because we really shouldn't be making any big change decisions on anything less than about 6 data points. If I'm only progress monitoring the 3 times a year for the kids who really, we said they don't really need anything else, that's not enough to make a decision. But yet a lot of times we won't have much of anything and still jump to the point of thinking, oh, well, we might want to test this kid for a possible disability. And that's really not enough data points to make that kind of a decision. So again, within that Tier 2 level, we have lots of kids that move around, right? I may have had a phonemic awareness problem and we got that taken care of, and now maybe I need to work on my fluency or my decoding. Whatever we find is the next step. So there's a lot of shifting within that level. We're still making decisions pretty much the same way. We're looking at the data and what does the data tell us? And if we're seeing things that are in the negative, then we definitely want to look at that fidelity piece really hard to see if that's what the issue was. And then we have to decide then, based on the data we have, do we stay where we are? Do we shift within that level? Do we need to provide additional supports? Or in some cases for students, we may say, you know what, I think we got that one under control. So for this area, the student may want to go back to just that base level. We can always hope for that, right? Sometimes we feel like it doesn't happen very often, but if we're assessing more regularly, we're more likely to be able to say, this one's ready to go back to just the universal supports. All right. So those are the kids who are dropping out of this. And then sometimes kids need a little more support within Tier 2, and then some kids are going elsewhere. So that little kid needs a little bit more support. So we're going to give him some Tier 3 supports. I think there were 2 of them that moved up in that direction. So at Tier 3, we're doing the same things. Again. Oh, 5 minutes? Okay. Okay. Same thinking process. So again, throughout the tiers, we're using data in a similar way. We're just collecting it more and more often the more intensive the services are. So here, I'm missing where it was here. Okay, it's not showing me that. But we're assessing more often. So 2 times a month is not enough. So in a lot of cases, what we're doing is looking weekly to see how students are. Sometimes in the case of serious behaviors, we're not waiting till the end of the week. We're taking it day by day and collecting data as well. So at a minimum, we'd really want to look at every week collecting some data. And we want to make sure that that data is aligned with the student's issue or the area that we're trying to support, and that the intervention is lined up. So again, if I've got a decoding problem, I need a decoding intervention, and I need something to assess, is my decoding getting better? When a lot of times what we're seeing is I have a reading problem, we haven't figured out what it is yet, so I'm getting a reading program that addresses all sorts of things, which means my specific problem isn't getting much attention, and then I'm getting like star reading or something to see where am I at. That's some information, and it's some help. It's not very intensive and targeted to what a student might need. I want to share a few resources with you that you can look at, and one is to go to the swiftschools.org website. You could spend months looking at all the resources, the videos, the printable resources, some things to help you get started in the first place to even see what is this all about. If we were going to take this on, which eventually to some degree we are all going to be taking on, having this kind of a system as part of that ESSA plan that Indiana has put forth, but that is a great place to start. RTInetwork.org, CAST.org. If you want some really good information on UDL, you can look at CAST or UDLcenter.org and find some really good resources there, as well as PBIS.org to provide more resources related to that behavior support. So I'm sorry this was so short. If there are any quick questions, we might have a minute, Kristen? Okay. So it's almost hard to know where to start when it's something global and kind of new. It's hard to even know where to start because there's no real how-tos yet. There will be some additional resource and guidance coming from the Department of Ed at some point. Not exactly sure when that will happen, but there is some guidance that will be out there to tell us how are we going to roll this out? What's it going to look like, and what kind of supports will be available to schools? All right, well, thank you guys.